Do you think a chicken farmer could design a car that could beat Ferraris in one of the biggest races in the world? Who I'm talking about here is Carroll Shelby. I've been a longtime fan of him, and recently I've had the pleasure of vividly researching his life and his career. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to recap his life before his racing career, how he earned his fame while racing, and what he did as an engineer afterwards. According to Motor Trend, he was born on January 11th, 1923 in Leesburg, Texas. He had a lot of heart disease as a kid, but the doctor actually signed him off on that when he was 13. But it turned out that was a big mistake, but we'll talk about that later. He entered the Air Force in December 1943, and during his training, he would actually fly over his fiance's house and drop love letters into her yard to flirt with her while he was away. When he came back, though, after serving in World War II for a bit, he married his said fiance, and he had a pretty happy life, but he was in some desperate need for some money. So he started a dump truck business, which kind of flopped, so he started a chicken farming business, which was very successful, but he was never really happy with it. What he was happy with, however, was his Ford V8 Hot Rod, which he used to drag race, and there he kind of found his niche for racing. He always grew up watching racing, and he would actually ride his BMX bike down to the racetrack every day. And he never bored him, and that was something he couldn't say about anything else. So, as kind of almost a bet, he asked one of his friends, "Hey, can I borrow your car?" Entered it in a race, won his very first race. And then the same day, he entered another race against much faster cars and much more experienced drivers and still won. And soon enough, he had a racing career, and it was anything but average. At one point, he was outperforming drivers who had cars with twice the horsepower. But the funniest part about it is, since he was always at the chicken farm, he really didn't have time in between races since he was working all the time. So he would get done with the chicken farm, not have time to change, end up wearing his overalls to the race, and still win home. And he became very passionate about what he was doing, and that passion actually earned him a spot in the Aston Martin racing team. He set a lot of records there, and he was doing really great until he had an injury in 1954. He had a broken arm for a long time, but he didn't want that to stop him from racing. So he would actually jerry-rig his cast onto his steering wheel by using duct tape so he could still drive while he was injured. He was having a lot of fun, but he really wanted a car that he designed, and he wanted it to be a lightweight V8 powered car. So he talked to Chevy. Chevy gave him 3 Corvettes and said, "Have fun," and he did, but then Chevy canceled the project and kind of crushed his dreams. Even worse news, his heart problems came back in 1960. Because of this, he had to quit racing, but he knew he had a little bit left in him, so he tried to keep going for as long as he could. In his last race, he actually had nitroglycerin tablet under his tongue, and he managed to finish the race, and then he actually managed to win that circuit for that year. So obviously his racing career was over, but his love for cars was still as much as alive than ever. And he still wanted that lightweight V8 engine. So he talked to this British car company called AC. They recently had their engine supply had bailed out, so they really needed an engine, and they had always lightweight cars. So Shelby made an agreement with them that if he could somehow find an engine, that they would supply the car frame for him. And he heard rumors that Ford was wanting to create a V8 that would go against the Corvettes that he originally built. So he talked to Ford, and they made a deal. And within a few months, he had his first car, the AC Cobra. Now Shelby wanted to take that car to this race called Le Mans. Le Mans is literally the biggest race of every year, and it's a 24-hour race event with Ferraris, Mercedes, Porsches, any fast car you can think of is going to be there. The problem was, this was Shelby's first car, and it was pretty rough, and during the trial runs, it did decent, but it did not good enough for Le Mans. So it went through some heavy revisions, and they ended up sending it to Le Mans with high hopes. The car came in 4th place, and it came first in its class, beating Ferrari. To celebrate his victory, he came back and built the Mach 3 Cobra, which was much faster, much sleeker, and just better designed overall. A few years later, in September 1964, the first Shelby Mustang was released, called the GT350. This was starting probably the most commonly known line of Mustangs, called the Shelby Mustang. But just a few years later, in 1969, he actually closed down Shelby Automotive Racing Company, and then a year later, he closed his partnership with Ford. This is because he was getting really frustrated with government regulations, because he always built big V8s, and during the time, they really were trying to focus on more economical cars, so it's hard to find anyone who would back him up for it. So he basically disappeared and went to Africa for 20 years and just had a break from everything. But he ended up coming back in 1982 when his friend from Lee, from Chrysler, asked him to get on his team and build some production cars for Dodge. Now, they were inline 4s, which are very small engines, and Shelby had a little bit of fun, but it wasn't nowhere near what he wanted to do. That was until Chrysler called him again and wanted a car based on his original Cobra. So in 1989, the Dodge Viper was released. Since he designed it so much, they let him be the driver for it in the Indy 500 as the pacer car. And Shelby was like around 70 at this point, and he was pretty popular. So he figured he'd play a little prank. While going on a turn at 100 miles per hour, he pretended like he had a heart attack. And everyone in the audience was freaked out, and his passenger almost had a heart attack himself. In 2002, though, something glorious happened. Ford and Shelby reunited. And just 3 years later, the GT500, the first Shelby Mustang to be seen in 35 years, was released. And it was the best one to date. In 2010, the Mustang got another redesign. And sadly enough, due to Shelby's old age, it was his last production Shelby Mustang that he will sit in. 1 month before his death, the Shelby 1000 was released. The GT500 had 500 horsepower. And the Shelby 1000, well, I'm just not going to tell you how much it had, but it was a good bit. It was by far his best car yet, and it had his most horsepower of any cars, and it was the trophy, the Shelby name. Carroll Shelby, the chicken farmer who raced Ferraris, earned his way into Hall of Fame and was possibly one of the greatest racers of all time. Died on May 10th, 2012. Despite his fame, Carroll Shelby started his life as any other person. He had dreams and did whatever it took to reach them. He's one of the most famous racers and one of the best engineers in the car industry, and he'll always be remembered. But the reason I love him isn't because of what he did, it's kind of how he got there. He never had an easy life, he never had any part of his racing career simply handed to him. He had a passion, and he fought with everything he had to pursue it. I think that's something that we can all learn from, and it really just kind of, to me, shows the American dream and kind of gives me a little bit of hope.